Did you know that I have a video game analysis channel where I've been making my way through all of the GameCube games, and where me and my buddy Tom Oliver take turns doing podcasts and think pieces about whatever we have to say about video games? Well, you do now. Go subscribe to that. This video's over there too, but I'm posting it here for the views. Metroid Prime is one of my favorite video games, and I did not come to that conclusion quickly. In writing this retrospective review, I want to present both the viewpoint of someone who's frustrated with the game, as well as someone who's deeply in love with it, because I've been both of those persons at different times. Since the game's release in 2003, I've always maintained the opinion that Metroid Prime is among the finest audio-visual accomplishments in gaming history. It doesn't even matter that the graphics were cutting edge for the time. It remains one of the finest looking 3D games on the strength of its art design. Nothing else I can think of is at once so foreboding and atmospheric, yet colorful, detailed, and alive. That I have a complete mental picture of this game world after only 2 full playthroughs is a testament to its impeccable level and art design feeding into one another, creating the single most memorable 3D world in a game that isn't Dark Souls. Because the game allows an unusually free range of movement for a 3D adventure, especially from a first-person perspective, it's therefore capable of structuring its environments with a ton of diversity. It also makes a point to involve multiple traversal styles in many of the same spaces. Many of the rooms contain secret challenges which can't be completed on the first pass, as you won't yet have the necessary power-ups to engage them, leading to the backtracking for which Metroid games are infamous. However, little of this backtracking is completely necessary, and if you learn your way around the map, then it won't take up that much of your time. Which brings me to the sort of thesis of this analysis, that the Metroid Prime experience changes dramatically between subsequent playthroughs. For nearly 16 years, I had regarded Metroid Prime as demotivationally frustrating. Most of my playthroughs were abandoned after losing on a lengthy stretch between save rooms. In particular, the phase on Mind's Descent, which comes about 2/3 of the way in, seemed like an unfairly overlong gauntlet, stuffed with difficult enemy encounters and multiple mini-bosses in the way of a checkpoint. This was obviously a deliberate skill check, especially considering how the game teases you with this easy but nerve-wracking maze puzzle just before unlocking the save room, knowing that you're likely to be at low health by the time you make it here. Suffice it to say, the game is quite difficult for a first-time player. When I finally powered through it, I spent hours on the final boss, growing insane with anger as I somehow kept getting worse at the lengthy platforming segment leading up to it, and fuming with losses that came towards the end of the nearly 20-minute battle. Part of me wanted to give up then and there, but another part kept realizing different things that I could try after each attempt, and was slowly but surely making it further and further into the battle. This is the trick to Metroid Prime. It's difficult but doable. Most of the struggle is not reflexive but knowledge-based. You may find yourself frustrated, for instance, that it's difficult to dodge enemy fire effectively in a protracted closed quarters shootout, but the reality is that if your shootouts are protracted, then you're not quite playing right. When fighting space pirates, you should almost exclusively be using charged shots with whichever beam is most effective. A charged ice beam will freeze most enemies to be easily broken with a single missile or another charge shot. Charged wave beams will stun enemies, and plasma beams will cause residual damage. Fighting the yellow pirates with regular power beams may seem the most difficult until you realize that they go down to a single super missile. But of course, on your first playthrough, you're more likely to bogart those missiles. Not only will you never be sure when you're gonna need them, but you probably won't know the locations of as many missile expansions lying along your path until you've spent some time poring over the world in search of secrets. When you're not sure how far away the next save room is, you might approach the game with trepidation, scanning enemies for hints on how to beat them, jumping slowly and observing your surroundings carefully, and probably desperately avoiding the lava and Magmor caverns, which by the end of the game I often found it more convenient to just wade right through. You will probably also get both stuck and lost. While the game has an optional hint system turned on by default, which highlights the next room you need to get to, these only give you a general idea of where to go next, with no indication of how to actually get there. Not only will you rapidly open up tons of options for backtracking and poring over prior rooms to see if your new items will do something different there, but there will be multiple routes to many destinations, and other places that you can get about halfway into before hitting a dead end and having to go back for the next power-up. Wandering into somewhere like the sunken pirate frigate before you have the gravity suit, and then facing the game's most obnoxiously difficult platforming challenge in order to get back out will make you feel angry and moronic. This is why it's easy to find the game infuriating, even though when I played it through a second time just a few days after my first completion, I not only did it in less than half of the time, but almost entirely without dying. That is the severity of difference which it makes to know what you're doing versus trying to figure things out. And when you're on the other side of that learning curve, it becomes apparent that this game can be both blisteringly fast and unbelievably fun to wrap around your little finger. One of the complaints I hear from first-time players is that you're tasked to backtrack through the entire game world at the very end to find 13 Chozo Artifacts hidden in some pretty esoteric locations. However, you don't actually have to wait until the end of the game to start acquiring these. In fact, depending on your curiosity and willingness to explore, you're likely to naturally pick up a few of them along your way. At the end of the game, you can scan a bunch of statues which outright tell you the exact rooms in which they're located. A lot of them do require you to come back to previous areas with later weapons, but if you actually know where all of them are, then you can much more easily plan out the perfect points at which to take little tangents from the main game to go collect them based on where you happen to be nearby. Here is where Metroid Prime's phenomenal map system comes into play. This fully manipulatable 3D map provides a literal polygonal mock-up of each room and even gives it a name so you can better keep track of where you've been. Getting from one side of the world to another can seem like an unwieldy pain in the ass since there's no central hub that takes you to each world, but instead a complex system of elevators strewn throughout. And it takes a lot of time spent staring at this map and knowing what's in each room to be able to plot the perfect course from one place to another. But the longer you spend with it, the more you'll realize that the layout is utter genius. If and when you get to a point where you're trying to beat this game as fast as possible, learning the perfect route from one point to another will be something like a revelation. And if you're trying a speed run, then factoring in artifacts or even items on a 100% run will turn solving the map into another game in and of itself. All the while, you'll be figuring out the fastest mode of travel for each individual room, what with your manageable jumping arc moving faster than your already quick running speed, and the morph ball even faster than that. Once you go completely insane, you'll realize that the random pipes and protrusions can be used to avoid even needing the spider ball power-up, that it's pretty easy to jump sideways forever, and that the game can be totally and ridiculously broken in plenty of technical ways. Even without breaking the game though, the amount of options it leaves to players are consistently admirable. Technically, you don't have to pick up any energy tanks or missile expansions, but if you decide to collect as much as possible, you can become overpowered pretty quickly. Likewise, if you choose to engage with it as little as possible, then the narrative is almost less existent than most NES games. Story cutscenes are rare and without dialogue nor almost any characters. Most of the unskippable cutscenes are just masks for loading screens or to indicate small changes in the environment. However, this isn't to say that the narrative doesn't exist. Get out your scan visor and you can read heaps and heaps of lore, not only explaining the history of the planet and what's been happening here lately leading up to the current events of the game, but also studying its flora and fauna and learning how they've adapted to the planet's harsh environment. Textual narrative elements aside, there's also a mountain of subtext provided through environmental storytelling, which you can pick up on just by observing your surroundings. The perfect example of these things melding together is right there in the tutorial stage aboard the pirate frigate. In one of the first areas, you'll find the sprawled corpse of a massive creature in the middle of a wrecked room full of dead and half-dead space pirates. The fact that some are still alive indicates that whatever happened here happened shortly before your arrival, and scanning the nearby info panels, you'll learn that one of the two parasite queens had escaped, subtly foreshadowing your upcoming run-in with the second one. Nothing in this game is without explanation, and thus all of it seems well considered and believable, adding that much more to the feeling that this world is a living place which just so happens to be conveniently designed for fun traversal. That it can accomplish so much immersion as to have that word appear in almost every review of the game despite sporting some of the gamiest design choices in 3D adventure history is a testament to the importance of environmental storytelling and verisimilitude over literal realism in game design. It is for this reason that aspects such as the infrequent checkpoints are so integral to the experience, and why the game couldn't have worked so well had it been just a little more forgiving to first-time players. The panic induced by watching your visor's toxic proximity warning shoot up, and then seeing Samus's shocked expression flashed back at her when it gets covered in fog for the briefest of moments, or the sheer terror of a Sheegoth rushing at you when you're lost and low on health, or dodging a Magmore's fire breath before you realize how easy they actually are to kill, will have your blood pumping and hair standing. Falling off of platforms for the 18th time may start to get under your skin, but as you groove along to one of the greatest soundtracks in video game history and finally fight your way to the top of that vertical shaft, the sense of victory is palpable. By the end of my first playthrough, I had made a short list of complaints. One fix I had in mind was the inclusion of a quick turn, because all too often I'd found myself falling off of a platform, then desperately trying to jump backwards onto it again because this would be faster than turning all the way around, only to then overshoot the platform on the way back. While every button on the GameCube controller is used constantly in this game, there's no real need to hold down L or R and press X at the same time, so this could have been the configuration for a quick turn, but that move also would have been disorienting and bad for use in combat, likely having caused certain players to overuse it to their detriment. Once I had played through certain platforming challenges multiple times, I realized that it's not so much about judging distance with your eyes as it is memorizing the length of time to hold down the jump button and turning as quickly as possible to make the next jump. Rooms which had initially given me trouble gave way to muscle memory, and suddenly most of these challenges were exciting to make seem effortless. That's the nature of Metroid Prime in general. It gives you a hell of a lot of tools to mess around with and keeps introducing new ones throughout the game, while tasking you to find the best use for each of those things in different situations. As long as you're constantly remembering that you have a scan and thermal visor, that your wave beam can power up certain devices, or your ice beam can freeze things in place, or your plasma beam can melt ice, or your power bombs can knock down walls, then you'll always be equipped to figure out how to progress. If you forget these things, you'll run around like an idiot until you remember, and then hopefully you won't forget again. You're expected to experiment, to try out what each beam will do to your enemies, or what each visor will reveal about each room, or what can and can't be destroyed with the super missile. Then, with that knowledge in hand, you're expected to try and see if you can't do things even better the second way through. A part of me found it frustrating that, unlike in the 2D Metroid games, your map doesn't indicate if there's any secrets in a given room, and the only way to check your overall progress percentage is on the startup screen. After playing through more than once, however, I think it's for the best that this game doesn't really encourage you to try for 100% on your first run. With a final completion rate of 69%, I was strong enough to finish the game. And even though I collected several more energy tanks and many more missile expansions on my second run, almost not even dying and blasting through in 2 sittings, I still only had 72% at the end. Trying to scour this game down to its bones when I wasn't even sure how long it was supposed to be or how much extra power I needed to complete it seemed like a non-inviting prospect. But when I've gotten good enough that enemy encounters are no longer scary and I can power through the story in a single afternoon, the question for replays becomes one of what have I missed? And at this point, finding something new in this world that I already feel like I know so well is downright mind-blowing. Some of the scripted sequences which play out in familiar locations when you're going back to collect the artifacts give an excellent taste of how much more there is to parts of the environment that you might completely gloss over the first time. And the feeling of seeing a suspicious protrusion in a room's map geography and then scouring the room to figure out how to access it, leading to some elaborate spider ball track all of a sudden, is immensely satisfying. As a first-person adventure game, Metroid Prime is practically in a category entirely of its own. It's a shame that many people will likely be turned off from this game just because of its unconventional controls, even though the game is built around them. It doesn't matter that there isn't freeform aiming and movement at the same time when enemy encounters are focused on crowd control and dodging projectiles, which the L targeting system is perfect for. Platforming and fighting enemies at the same time would have been an absolute nightmare with a twin-stick setup, and while I appreciate why some players prefer the Wii version's free aiming capabilities, I personally find it incredibly awkward to turn by aiming the pointer at the side of the screen, and I think it changes the whole game feel, but your mileage will vary. I am not ordinarily the type of player who makes multiple passes through a game. Most games involve a lot of repetition and filler, moments which exist only to either elongate the campaign or to shake it up in some way so it feels more like a complete experience. Usually these shakeups do not result in the game being more fun. I can't stand scripted sequences which have nothing to do with the core appeal of a game, nor repetitive encounters which require the exact same level of thought and consideration every time. I would prefer to play a game which is tight and concise, pushing its mechanics as far as it can by creating every possible permutation of challenge which they allow for. Metroid Prime will not task you to do the exact same thing more than a couple of times. Most of its rooms are distinct, and even if you have to fight the same types of enemies again, they will be in different configurations, or the environment will have changed the optimal strategy for dealing with them. Even if you're you're just making a quick run from one side of the map to the other between places you've already been, the game will frequently change the enemy arrangement of each room depending on how much progress you've made, and you'll constantly be switching visors and beams on the fly in order to tackle each unique challenge without slowing down, or seamlessly gliding in and out of the gorgeous morph ball to crawl along spider tracks. Everything you do in this game feels incredible, and you're constantly doing slightly different things, even in the process of hauling ass and casually wrecking everything in your path. Much like Dark Souls, which I also love because of how you can go from a slow and lengthy first playthrough to banging the game out in an afternoon while backflipping in a loincloth, it's a game which gets more and more fun the more of it you play, and which eventually carries the warm feeling of revisiting a familiar and fascinating world in which you can exert a greater and greater amount of will with a powerfully satisfying traversal and combat loop. While I can't say that Metroid Prime has the level of replay value that Dark Souls does, given there isn't a huge wealth of choices to be made about what order to play it in or which weapons to use and when, it does have a few legs up on that game. For one, an untouchable soundtrack which plays more consistently and adds even more atmosphere, and also much more freedom of movement, which allows for the level layouts to involve more variety. Not to compare apples to oranges too much here, but in spite of the very different gameplay styles, I do think these games are two of a kind in creating the most deeply engaging 3D worlds I've ever adventured through. I give Metroid Prime 16 out of 16 GameCubes. Even though I gave up on the game at least 5 times over the course of 16 years, I constantly found myself picking it up again because it's just so goddamn satisfying. Of all the games I played as a teen, I could most easily remember every detail of which parts of this one's map I'd seen. Most easily hum the tunes from this game that I'd never even beaten. It helps that I'm a gigantic fan of the 2D Metroid games and longtime worshipper of Super Metroid, but I honestly think that Prime competes with it as my favorite in the franchise, just for how much is added by the third dimension. I hope to return this game many times more throughout my life, and that if you've ever given up on it out of frustration, but still found the memory of it lingering in your mind, you'll give it another chance and try to push through. It's not nearly as long or as threatening as you might think. If you're worried that you're gonna have to backtrack and pick up more energy tanks before you can beat the part you're stuck on, just go ahead and do it. When you go back, you'll realize it doesn't actually take more than a couple minutes to get from any one place on the map to another, thanks to all of the puzzles which remain solved or roadblocks which don't respawn in the path you've bore through the levels. And you're probably a lot farther into the game than you thought. My second playthrough only took about 6 hours, and even without glitches, I'm sure I could get it down to 3. I will definitely end up talking about Metroid Prime 2 in the future, but for now I only want to tell you that that game is very different. And if you're thinking about skipping straight to the second game because you've heard it's better, I would not recommend doing so. You are going to miss out on one of the greatest games ever made if you skip out on Metroid Prime. If you have any way of playing this game, and you do if you know how to emulate, then you should make a point of doing so. If you enjoyed this video, then please subscribe to the channel and share it around. We want to be able to make more lengthy analysis videos about games, but this channel is currently not successful enough to justify spending a lot of time on it. So if you want more, then please help us out in making it worth our while. Always remember to be the games you want to see. I am Games, signing out.